First class?
Yep.
Alright, cool.
How are you guys? So this is lighting 1, lighting 2. All right, just give me a few seconds. So, are you guys mostly, what track are you guys on? The games track or the how many people are doing games track? So it's all film track? Okay, cool. What term is this for you guys? 4? Okay. Just give me 1 second. So lighting 2. All right. So he has here that we're going to talk about a physical camera. So all right. Just let me figure something out here. Just feels like it's too low res. I don't know. Okay. Anyway, so all right. So the physical camera. So let me just open up a scene and we'll get to it right away. So a lot of this class will be looking at the physical camera as if it was a photography class, really. And it's kind of cool because I kind of learned, I do a lot of cinematography, but I learned 3D first. So I had already used the physical camera and Mentor Ray and stuff like that. But being able to do being able to understand it in Maya actually made me understand the physical camera in the real world better, and vice versa. So they both helped each other out. So let me just open up a scene and we'll get to this. So where is it? Let's just use this one. Okay. Okay. So here we have this very simple scene. It's just a little corridor with one light up above, and then we have a few spheres. Okay. I've already added a keyframe, so if I lose my position, I could just snap back to it. And I'm going to go to View Select Camera, and I'm going to go to Attributes, V-Ray, and I'm going to turn on Physical Camera. Okay? So when I do that, it's going to give me an extra drop down at the bottom of this list. V-Ray, Physical Camera. And there it is, Extra V-Ray Attributes. Okay? So when we go down here, we have a few different settings. First thing we have to do is just turn this on again. So treat as V-Ray Physical Camera. Okay? Let me just hide this thing. Fuck, why does my resolution look so fucked? Okay, so I turn on the physical camera, and now you can see that we have all these options down below. Let me just get rid of a few things here. Okay. So view select camera. Okay. So treat as V-Ray physical camera. So below that we have type. We have still camera, movie camera, and video camera. Really, we're just going to focus on two of them, and not even. We're really just going to focus on movie camera. The big difference between the still camera and the movie camera is the shutter speed. Okay, if you're taking, if you're filming something, the shutter speed can only go as fast as the frames per second. It cannot go any faster than that. Sorry, it cannot go any slower than that, because if it did, it will have to jump into the next frame, right? A still camera, you could actually leave the shutter open for 2 years if you wanted to. It would blow out the image, but you could leave the shutter open for that one image for as long as you want, or as short a time as you want. But a film camera, if it's capturing 24 frames per second, actually it's 23.976 frames per second, it can't go, a frame can't be captured for 10 minutes or for 2 minutes because it's 24 frames per second, okay? So that's the big thing. So since we're doing everything with film anyhow, we're always going to use movie camera, okay? The other thing is, you can see that when we use still camera versus movie camera, the one thing that gets grayed out is the shutter speed changes from the length of the shutter to the shutter angle. So you can see right now we have this set at film camera, and we see a shutter angle, and the shutter speed is grayed out. When we set this to a still camera and we scroll back down here, you can see the shutter angle has now been grayed out, and the shutter speed is now something that we could adjust. Again, because the shutter speed could go on forever, whereas when you're using a film camera, it's controlling the angle of the shutter. We'll get to that in a minute, okay? But for now, let's just focus on leaving this as a movie camera, okay? Next up, we have our film gate in millimeters, okay? This is your focal length, the focal length of your camera. If I come over here for a minute, some of my files don't transfer over. If I come over here and I adjust this, the focal length of my camera is going to change. Right now, you can see that it says specify field of view, and it says from the Maya camera. So whatever you change in here, film gate in millimeters will up here. Where am I going? Right here, focal length. Whatever we change here will automatically adjust in the V-Ray physical camera, because we have specified field of view from the Maya camera. So as you change your millimeters, you are also changing the field of view. So right now, let's just set this to 35. Okay, or let's do 28. Okay, so let's go back over here. Next up, we have a zoom factor, which we're going to leave as 1. Distortion type, we're going to leave all these to the default. But then this is where we get to the really important stuff. The frame the F number, and your shutter angle, and your ISO. Okay? So when you hear someone say, oh, whenever you buy a Nikon camera, it comes with a shitty lens. Whenever I used to hear that, I used to just be like, oh yeah, they come with shitty lens, but I had no idea what the fuck they really meant. I just went along with it to look smart. But really, what they mean is not necessarily the construction of the lens being shitty, even though it is a side effect of when the glass is cheap. Usually the housing is cheap as well, because they wouldn't invest the money in an expensive housing if the glass is crappy. But it all comes down to the lower an f-stop goes, usually the more expensive the lens is. F-stop is the sensitivity to light that the lens has. The lower this number becomes, the more it can see in darkness. Okay? So lens technology is something that has gotten better through years, but it hasn't improved as dramatically as, say, our ISO, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So the lower this number becomes, the more you can see in darkness. So let's just look at this for a minute. If I were to render, let's just turn off physical camera for a second, and let's just render this image out. And let's make the size a little bit bigger. So let's just render this out, and let's take a look. Okay, so this is not using the physical camera at all. This is just the regular render. Okay, so it's going to react just based on the lights you have. You balance it around, and it's all good. It doesn't look into the lens or anything at all. It's just how much lights do you have, the intensity of the lights, the shaders. That's it. Okay, the minute I turn on treat as V-Ray physical camera, and let's actually look at this thing in our V-Ray frame buffer. This resolution is driving me crazy. So use V-Ray frame buffer. So let's render that again. So this is now with a V-Ray physical camera. Let's create a little history here. Okay, so this was the image without physical camera, and this is the image with physical camera. First thing you notice is, of course, it's much darker. It's much darker because the f-stop is way too high. So a really good lens, the f-stop goes down to around 1.2, 1.8. That's considered like a really good lens. And there are lenses that go lower than that. A good example is like Stanley Kubrick got a couple of lenses from NASA to shoot some films in the 70s that were all lit with candlelight. And those, I think, would go to like f-stop 0.8, which was crazy. It's unheard of. And a lens like that would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, so the lower this number becomes, the more light it's going to allow. And let's just take a look at what this is actually doing. So let's come over here. And let's look at an aperture. Okay, so here we could see an f-stop of f1.4. You can see the irises are the most open. An f-stop of f16 means the iris is much more closed. The more closed it is, the more open it is. We're going to get to this in a second, but just think about this for a minute. What do you do when you're trying to read a book and you're having a hard time reading it because it's blurry or whatever? What do your eyes naturally do? Your irises or your eyes squint. They squint and everything falls into focus. The more closed your iris is, the more everything falls into focus. The more open something is, the more things fall out of focus quicker. So a great example of people that photograph everything with an f1.4 is if you've ever seen, for example, wedding photography. These guys basically have made an entire career out of buying, fast lenses and just shooting with things out of focus in the background, and people think it's really beautiful. For example, this, right? Things go out of focus extremely fast because you're shooting with an f1.4. Okay? So you see how things go out of focus really quickly. Things go out of focus really quickly. Okay? So that's an effect of f1.4. So why is nothing going out of focus here? Nothing is going out of focus here because we have not turned on enable depth of field. Okay? So really, when you turn on physical camera, if this was really a physical camera, this would turn on immediately by default. So let's just turn on enable depth of field, and let's turn on enable bokeh effects. Bokeh is the shape that the highlights of the image, when they're out of focus, take the shape of your iris. So I'll give you an example. So if you come over here, if you look at these here, you can see that they all look like circles, but really, if you kind of analyze it, they look like octagons or hexagons because they're actually the shape of the aperture. Okay? So your highlights, when they go out of focus, take on the shape. They bloom up and they take on the shape of an aperture. That's why if I were to grab let me come over here. Let me open up Nuke for a second. Jesus Christ, what is going on with this computer? What the fuck is going on here? I need to launch it through what?
C drive. Go to C drive. Search up there.
Through here?
C drive, yeah.
Man, what a pain in the ass. Is this only this loud? Oh, it's on the nuke, yeah. No, it's here, I got it. I think it's in there. So let me find an image of city at night. Actually, let's use this one here. It's a nice image. So I'll save this image in my desktop. Okay, and I'll just drag this into Nuke for a second. Okay, so like I said, bokeh takes on the shape of your aperture. So a lot of people, I see this happen often, they'll grab an image like this and they want to try to make it look like certain parts of their image look like they're out of focus. So they'll come over to Photoshop or here and they'll go to filter, they'll go to blur, or they'll go to like a Gaussian blur. Let's just use a blur. It's basically the same thing. And they'll blur this out and be like, oh, look, it's out of focus now. But that doesn't feel photographic because this is not actually what happens when an image goes out of focus. When an image goes out of focus, it has a bokeh in it. So now if we use this to focus, you can see that as this goes up, the highlights scale up and they take on the shape of the aperture, which you can control apertures, not so much in this one, in the default Nuke to focus, but there's a lot of other plugins like Lenscare where you could actually control the number of blades and whatnot. But you can see that this and this look very different. This doesn't look photographic, but this does. Do you see the difference there? So when you try to defocus things, you want to make sure that you turn on this so that the highlights take on the shape. That effect is called bokeh. So when we're in Maya, we turned on our enable bokeh effects over here. Okay? There's enable vignetting effect, which I'm going to turn off. That was probably just something that I turned on from the previous class. And let's render this out and see what we get. Okay, so now you can see we have a few things going out of focus. This was completely in focus. This now has things out of focus. And the thing in focus seems like it's either this guy here or I think it's this guy. It is kind of low res, but it's this guy here. So how do we control what goes in and out of focus? We'll get to in a little bit. But what I want to do right now is come back over here to where we see our f-stop and set our f number to something like 2. Okay, so now we're opening up our lens aperture. And when you do that, you're going to see that things go out of focus much, much quicker now. And the other big thing is you can see that the image looks about 3 times as bright as it used to look. Okay, so everything is out of focus. So maybe we could try to get something in focus. So let's try to get this red ball in focus just to see. Okay, if I go to display, heads up display, and I go to object details, I can click on this object and you can see that it says the distance from the camera is 15.048. Okay, 15.048. Or I could we'll get to that in a second. So let's just do it like this for now. So 15.048. I'll click on this thing and then I'll go to select camera. We'll scroll back down here and we're going to go to specify focus. So 15.048, specify focus 15.048. When I render this now, you will see that the ball will be completely in focus and everything else will be out of focus. Okay, so it has to do with a few things now. We've selected the focal plane by going to specify focus. That's one. But the biggest thing is the fact that we've changed our f-stop. If we were to come back over here, let's say this looked perfect. This is the amount of light that you want, but you want everything to be in focus. You're like, wait, I want this to be in focus. This is the right amount of light, but I want things to all be in focus. What would you do? You could bring down the f-stop and increase the brightness of all the lights, but in a real-world scenario, you cannot say, okay, this is exactly the setup that I want at Gnomon, so now just change all the lights at Gnomon and make them twice as bright. That would be extremely expensive and time-consuming. So you have to find another solution. So if the brightness level is correct, and remember that brightness level we're getting from the combination of the light's intensity, but most importantly from our f-stop, then we have to come up with another solution. That other solution would be this. We would actually, if you want everything in focus, we would have to come over here and set our f-stop to something like 10. Let's render that again, and you're going to see that it's going to look all in focus, but it's going to look extremely dark. So now we need to do something else to counter the f-stop to bring the brightness back into the image. And what you would do for that is you would bring up the ISO. The ISO is the sensitivity, not of the lens, but the sensitivity of either the film, if you were shooting back in the days, or the sensitivity of a sensor, the digital sensor. The higher this ISO value goes, the more it can see at night. So now you have like a seesaw effect. As the f-stop goes up, you might want to bring down the ISO. As the ISO goes down, the other one goes down or up, or they both stay the same, whatever. But this becomes the balancing act. Now, not in Maya, but in the real world, you would think, oh my God, if you have this ISO setting, you could just crank it up to whatever you want. Why do you even care if you have a fast lens? The reason is ISO speed. This is really where technology has taken off the most in the past few years, is in ISO stuff, because now we're dealing with digital sensors and stuff like that. The higher the ISO value becomes, the side effect of that is the noisier the image becomes. Not in Maya, but in the real world. So if you ever have a camera you're trying to shoot on automatic, they have ISO settings. You just know that the higher that ISO goes, the noisier it becomes. A great example of that is something you've all done, is your camera has automatic ISO settings. So when you try to photograph something at night, or you try to film something at night, what happens to the image? It's grainy as shit. That's because the higher the ISO, the noisier the image, okay? So if I grab that ISO now and I set it to 800, which most cameras can do an ISO of 800 no problem. Now we still have some things a little bit out of focus in the background, but the image looks much more like what we originally wanted in terms of the brightness. So we still have a natural depth of field, but a very subtle one, which makes it look photographic. It's nice, but everything is in focus. And if you wanted things to be even more in focus, we would just have to go to our f-stop, our f number, and set it to f16. This will, of course, darken the image even more. So we might have to bring up the f-stop. We have to bring up our ISO. So let's take a look at that. So let's look at the progress here. This was the first one completely out of focus. This was everything in focus, or mostly everything in focus, because you see how dark it got. This is when we increased our ISO, but you can see that the background was still a little bit soft. And this is when we brought up our f-stop, making this extremely sharp even in the background, or much sharper anyway. So now we could get our ISO and set it to 1300. An ISO of 1300 is a little bit on the higher side, but cameras can definitely do it. So now you can see you balance it out. When I look at this thumbnail as opposed to this thumbnail, I could clearly see that it is still much darker. So we could get that ISO and set it to like 2300 just to see. And we bring this down. And that looks closer. So you could see these guys are in focus. This is the most in focusing, but there's still a natural softening going on. Okay? So we compare that to this. Okay? Now, one thing we could also do, let me come over here, just look at something real quick. Okay, so we could click on this guy over here, distance from camera 8.856, view select camera, 8.856. Now we could render that, and this guy in the foreground will be the one in focus now. Okay, and if we want everything to go out of focus, what would we do? Except for this guy. Do you guys know? The lower the f-stop, the more things go out of focus. So you have to bring this f-stop back down to 1.4. What will happen when I bring this down to 1.4 besides the image going more out of focus? It's going to become much brighter, so we might have to get that ISO now and bring it back down, because look what happens. Now this guy's in focus, and you can see it's extremely bright now. So bright that it doesn't help, it just is going to look completely blown out. So imagine how blown out this would look like if you were shooting this outdoors in sunlight. So we have to get our ISO and bring this guy down. So we go ISO 300. This guy is in focus, everything else will go out of focus. And the ISO might still be too high because this is getting completely blown out. Okay? So let's adjust our ISO, bring it down to 100. And let's render this. So back in the days when you look at these old movies, like let's just look at Wizard of Oz. Okay. And you see them filming. One of the things that you notice a lot with these behind the scenes photos are a ridiculous amount of light, just crazy amounts of light. And these lights, if you've ever seen them at Noma, they do have the old Mole Richardson lights in the stage. They're so motherfucking hot that you could cook a steak on this thing without a problem. They're fucking insanely hot. So if that's one of them, imagine having 100 ovens that are pointing at you at the same time. These sets would be so fucking hot that the Lion and the Tin Man or whatever would constantly be passing out from heat exhaustion. It was ridiculously hot. And why would they do that? The reason is, back in the days, the ISO numbers would only go to an ISO of something like 10. So you had to have a shitload of light to compensate for the fact that film was so primitive at that point that it wasn't as sensitive to light. So they had to do all these advancements in trying to speed up the lenses, because that's an optical, physical thing that they could understand much better than the higher tech film at the time. So as ISO speeds have gotten better and better and better, you can now shoot with almost strictly candlelight. I'll show you something that's incredible. If you look at this video here is pretty fucking incredible. And this is where technology's going in the next few years. So this is obviously a guy filming someone making a bonfire at the beach. You can see the ISO is currently set to 1600. So now we know what that is. That's the sensitivity of the film. He's shooting on a 2.8 f-stop, which is not the fastest, but it's not considered slow by any means. So that's another word. When you hear someone say, oh, that's a fast lens versus a slow lens, fast means it can go to a lower number, and slow means that it's like an f4, an f5, an f6. And when I mean an f4, an f5, an f6, it means that if it's a zoom lens, for example, some zoom lenses, as you adjust the zoom, the f number increases and decreases as the barrel extends, less light goes in. The zoom lenses that do not adjust and they stay at a constant 2.8 are much more expensive. But anyway, so we know this is shot with a decent lens and a pretty high ISO to begin with, okay? Just to put this in perspective, the camera that was used to shoot Prometheus, for example, it can, but it is not ideal to go up to a 1600 ISO. That's a $50,000 camera, okay? So this is a pretty fucking good setup, and this is what you would expect to see when you film someone in a bonfire at night. So the Sony camera has an ISO rating of up to, what is this, 409,600? This is fucking insane, right? So what we're going to see here is they're going to start increasing the ISO. So now we're at ISO 6400, right? We're still with the same lens, 12,800, right? And you're going to see this is going to keep getting brighter and brighter. One thing to note, though, is as the numbers start getting extremely high, it is going to start appearing noisier. But all of a sudden, this image that was clearly like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, maybe 10 o'clock at night, now looks like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 6 o'clock, the sun is starting to set. And for all we know, they shot this at 11 p.m. Now it's 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., right? And this is going to get to the point where it's going to look like it's just shot in an overcast day. But this is shot completely at nighttime. So the ISO speeds, the technology is going to improve to the point where as ISO numbers go this high, they just will not become noisier anymore. But at a certain point, you'll almost be able to shoot in pitch black darkness and say that it's an overcast day, which is pretty fucking incredible. Right? I mean, that's fucking black magic right there. It's pretty incredible. But you can see it is definitely much noisier when it gets to this number. So ISO speeds. So now, remember, the two things are our ISO speed and our F number. So 1.4, 100, we have an image that looks like this. Okay? When you're doing depth of field effects like this, keep in mind two things. one thing, a lot of people I've heard at Gnomon say, oh, I've been told that you should always model in real world scale. I've never worked at a company in 15 years where we modeled in real world scale ever. Never. I've never worked in a company that uses real world scale. Not at Rhythm and Hues, not at Sony, not at Phil Tippett Studios, not at Digital Domain. Never. We've never used it. Not on Avatar, not on nothing. We've never used real world scale. We always use a different scale because dynamics don't like to work in real world scale. So we would always work in 1 foot equals 1 centimeter or something like that. But we would never use 1 foot equals 1 foot. Okay? So what does that mean? As you start working in unreal world scales, that the depth of field of things is still treating this thing as if it was let's say you scale your set down, it might treat things almost as if it was a miniature, right? So you have to be very aware of how things really go out of focus in the real world so that your images don't look like miniatures. Even if you didn't know any of the stuff that I was talking about, which most of you guys probably know this, even if you didn't stop and think about it, you know it intuitively when you see a photograph. When you see this, you know it's a miniature. Besides the fact that it's an insect, you know it's a miniature instantly because of how quick things go out of focus. You immediately know, oh, that's a macro photo because things go out of focus really quick. They go out of focus really quick because it's a miniature image, right? If you've ever seen this effect called a tilt lens, it tries to fake that effect on a larger object, and you can see when you look at this for a second, you think it's like a model railroad set or something, because you know that when things go out of focus that quickly, it usually means that it's a miniature. Okay, so if you're doing a hallway, and this hallway is hundreds of feet long, and things go out of focus this quick. From here to here, things are completely out of focus. You're probably telling people, hey, this is a miniature. So be careful. Don't get like depth of field happy and start making everything look like it's, a photograph of a ladybug. So just keep that in mind. Okay? Okay, so let's look at some other things. So f-stop versus ISO. The other thing we have is our shutter angle. Okay? Your shutter angle, for the most part, is a setting that I never change when I'm filming something. I always leave it at a shutter angle of 180 degrees. Okay? So this is based on degrees. So it goes from 360 to 0. Okay? 180 is going to give you the most traditional filmic look. If you've ever seen a movie that looks kind of soap opera-y, and you don't know what it is, you're like, there's something about that looks video-ish, it's because they're shooting with a higher shutter angle. So a good example of somebody that shoots high shutter angles is if you've ever seen Michael Mann movies, if you've ever seen, let's see, what's a good one? Yeah, that's Collateral is actually a really good one. But I want to show Dillinger for a reason, because Dillinger is a Public Enemies. This is it. It's supposed to be a period film. Michael Mann is one of the best directors in the world, but there were certain things about this movie that felt video-ish, like right there. A lot of the reason why you look at that, you're like, wait, that doesn't feel period. When you look at that right there, it's because the shutter angle, he likes to shoot with a shutter angle of 360 degrees, which gives it like that. That feels kind of video-ish. Do you see it? Maybe you don't, but it feels like videotape. And the reason why it feels like videotape is because the shutter angle affects the motion blur of the image. The higher that shutter angle becomes, the less motion blur there is. So it makes things feel more quote-unquote real. but as they look more real, they look more magical and cinematic, and they look more real / video cassette. So he loves it, and I'm not going to tell this guy that he's doing it wrong, but that's usually the thing. A shutter angle of 180 degrees is going to give you the motion blur that you expect to see in almost every movie you've seen in your life. And a shutter angle, the higher that goes, the less motion blur you're going to get, and the more soap opera-y feel, video cassette feel you're going to get. Okay? Lower the number, more motion. Higher the number, more motion blur. Lower the number, less motion blur. Sorry, opposite. The lower the number, the more motion blur. The higher the number, the less motion blur. Okay? So, for me, I like the way movies like The Godfather look, just classic movies. I always set the shutter angle to 180, and I never fucking touch it, okay? So a shutter angle of 180 is the equivalent in a regular camera of 1/48th of a second. So it is double the speed of your frames per second. Okay? It is the equivalent. Okay? So let's do some shutter angle tests here. So let's come over here, let's create a new scene. And we'll create a V-Ray sphere. And we'll create a polygon sphere here. And we'll add one keyframe over here. And we'll add another keyframe over here. We will have a total of 10 frames. Okay, so let's just zoom in and take a look. So very simple. So if we render this right now, we'll get something that looks like this. Let's just create a floor so we have some sort of a bounce light. And we'll just put a V-Ray material on this. And we'll turn on GI. And let's just lower this. Or let's just hide it. We'll just... So let's go to like frame 4. Okay, so you can see there's no motion blur right now. We're going to go to View, Select Camera, Attributes, V-Ray, Physical Camera. We scroll down to the bottom, Treat as V-Ray Physical Camera, and we'll turn on Enable Motion Blur, and we'll render this. Okay, so right now if we're not seeing anything, it could be many things. Always check your alpha first, so you know, oh, if we're not seeing anything, it's probably the f-stop. So we come back over here. F-stop, let's set an f-stop of 1. Let's render it again. So you can see we now have motion blur. Okay? We're going to set this to movie camera, and we'll come over here to our shutter angle. And let's render this again. A shutter angle of 180 degrees. You can see you have a real nice motion blur. We set this a shutter angle of 360. reset this to 0. So this is also affecting our lighting as well, of course, because the lower this number becomes, the less light you're giving it, or more light you're giving it. I'm saying everything in reverse, actually. I'm sorry. So you can see that shutter angle. Okay. So I like it at 180. That's what is set on most films. Okay. Okay, another thing that we have here is our white balance. By default, your white balance is just set to white, and I recommend you just leave it at white. The best way to look at white balance is the temperature of the white values. Okay? If you look at this room right now, all of the temperature of this room, for the most part, is yellow. All the lights are warm lights. So the color white, if I were to sample like the paper on your books, if I were to sample it with a Photoshop sampler, it would probably come out as white with a tint of yellow. So white balance is a way for you to counter that so that the whites actually appear as white. You could do that inside of Maya, but I don't recommend doing it here. It's much better to do this stuff inside of Nuke. So we'll just leave this alone. We have enable vignetting effects, and let's talk about that. So let me open up another scene. Okay, so I think this already has vignetting turned on. Let's take a look. So we'll go to View, select Camera. Nope, it's not on yet. So, but it is on here. So enable vignetting effects. So you can see when I render this now, you're gonna get black shadows on each corner here. So back in the days when you would get cheap lenses, you would get this vignetting in the corners, and it was something that photographers hated. And it's basically you're seeing the shadows or the shape of the barrel casting a shadow on the actual film gate or the sensor. And they hated it. Now that we've completely gotten rid of it with technology, people kind of miss it, and they realize that it kind of framed the images really nicely. So you could turn this on and it would automatically give you a vignetting effect, and then you could control the amount. I don't recommend rendering this because once you have it on, you can't get rid of it, but it's extremely simple to add this in Nuke. Okay? Number of blades, so going back to our aperture here, it's just the number of blades that we're going to use. So 1 blade, 2 blades, 3 blades, so you can count this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So why would you even care about this setting? Well, if you have a scene that is all practical, it was shot on a real location, and then you're trying to render CG elements to add on top of it, and you were going to render it with a physical camera, then you want to make sure that the bokeh effects that we talked about earlier match. So here you would control the number of blades, and then you could control the rotation of those blades. Okay? Aperture map. This is pretty cool here. So aperture map allows you to load up any image Let me see if I have one here already. So let me just find, like, this one, this image right here is what I want. So I'm going to just grab this image here. And let's just call this RGB. And we'll save this out. I'm not sure it could open up PNG files. So let's just open that up in Photoshop and Jesus Christ, this fucking thing. So, okay, so let's just open this up in Photoshop and save it out as a TIFF or as something else. So I'm gonna go and just go to File, Save As, and we'll just save this as a TIFF file. Okay, so let's just do a few real quick things. We'll set our f-stop to 1.4, which we have already. Our shutter speed, let's set this to movie camera. 180 is exactly what we want. An ISO of 300 is probably what we want. Let's make this be the focus of 15.048. We could turn on vignetting effects if we want. Let's just turn it off for now. Enable bokeh effects, that's fine. Enable depth of field, that's fine. We'll turn off motion blur since there's no motion blur anyway. And we went into our aperture map and loaded up this guy here. Okay? And now if we render this, we're gonna get a really cool render. It's actually not doing it, so let's see what's going on here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So let's reload that. The fact that it's not showing me the little preview worries me because it's not giving me any sort of effect. So let's look at our channels. Oh, it's because it's in index mode. So let's set the mode to RGB color, save it, and close it. So it's just the color profile is one that Maya doesn't understand. Okay, so we'll just render this now, and you could see it's gonna do this really cool thing where it's gonna make it look, it'll make the render look like it's shot with like really old, crappy lenses, almost like a natural Instagram effect, which Instagram effects are basically just trying to mimic old Russian lenses. Russian lenses are famous for being extremely shitty, but extremely awesome. So they're the best of the worst. So have you ever seen like have you ever heard of like Lomo lenses? They're super sought after, very difficult to find, very expensive now, which is funny because they were created as a cheap alternative to expensive lenses. But now that images have gotten so perfect, people want the characteristics of these lenses. So you can see how cool this is. The render naturally looks like it's got chromatic aberration. It's got all kinds of fuck ups in the image. The grain has all these different colors in it, and it's just by changing the aperture map. So in the real world, you can do this to a point. If you were to grab a camera, if you were to grab your camera at home and open the f-stop all the way, right? And you were to put a piece of paper and tie it up to the front of the lens so it's completely black, a black piece of paper. And you were to cut a shape like this into the paper, when things go out of focus, they'll take on that shape. So you could literally do stuff like this, which is pretty cool. So you could put hard shapes, you could put whatever you want like this, and it'll take on that shape, which will look extremely beautiful. So this is not a Photoshop effect, this is a real world effect from all the highlights going out of focus and taking on the shape of the aperture. It's pretty cool. Okay, so that's just what that is. If you go to View, Select Camera, if you go to aperture map, you could load that up. The thing that I did to hack it is by loading up this RGB map, you get that crazy effect. Okay, anyway, so what I want you guys to do now is load up this scene, the hallway scene. It's in my instructor files. So instructor files, Miguel Ortega. Let me see where I put it. Depth of field, and use depth. Just use the one that's called depth of field. Okay, and I want you guys to do a few things. Number one is you have all these balls. Do a few renders where this is in focus, where the red ball is in focus, and then where the furthest most ball is in focus. So I want to make sure that you guys can control what is in focus and balance the lights and everything, again, by controlling your f-stop, your ISO, and your shutter speed should stay at a consistent 180. Okay? And I'll go around in a second. Just give me 1 second, I gotta take this photo. questions? You okay? Okay, are you jumping around? Okay. Here's another thing that's kind of cool. If you IPR this thing, what the fuck is going on with this laboratory? Okay, if you IPR this, if you right click, you could go to set focus point and click on any spot. So you don't have to write down the value, come over here and type it again. You could just right click, set the focal point, and then adjust it here. So it's a little more intuitive this way. So you get the crosshairs and just select it. The problem with this method, and the reason why I don't use this really as a default go-to, is because usually you're not rendering 4 balls in a hallway. You're rendering something that could take hours and hours and hours to render, and IPRing IPRing is not an option. You have to be an IPR, right click, set focus point.
Oh, and then, gotcha.
You still have to make sure that you have enabled depth of field turned on, and specify focus, I believe, has to be turned on as well. And whatever you set is going to adjust in there. So you can see when I'm adjusting these settings, it is updating here. So you could do like a rack focus. Like if you have 10, here we have 23 frames. We could select this guy over here, specify focus, set key, go to frame 23. Oh, it might give us an issue here now because it's got a keyframe. So yeah, you'll have to write down the values once you set a keyframe in. It won't jump. So you'll just have to write down on frame this, I want this number. On frame 1, I want this number. And then add a keyframe, go to that frame, type down that same value, add a keyframe, jump to the last frame and add a keyframe. Again, I don't use this really for production, but it's just good to know that it's there. Let me know if you guys have questions. If anybody wants me to go over any of it again, let me know. So you should have 3 renders for me. I'm gonna go around in a minute. Foreground ball in focus, middle ball in focus, background ball in focus. If you get the concept of f-stops and ISOs, the cool thing is you'll actually be able to use your DSLR in automatic mode. once you're done with those three, you could also put that RGB map. I'll put it in there as well and throw it into the aperture map. Let me put it in there. So that RGB map is in the same folder now as well. All right, let's see what you guys got. For what? I go to display, heads up display, object details. Heads up display. You see it? Yeah, so now whatever you select will give you the value. How are you doing? What? Keep going. How are you? Make sure that you balance the value, the brightness. And right now, it shouldn't drastically change in brightness as you adjust. How are you? Good?
Oh, sorry. I couldn't figure out how to get me to click on it.
You have to like
Where?
So that focus thing is only on IPR. You right click, set focus point. How are you? Lovely. How are you?
Let's see what you do once.
Do you have the RGB stuff? Cool. You good?
Yeah.
You good? Beautiful. So now do one that looks the same as those, but the same brightness levels, but everything is in focus. You have to do one. So pick any up. Well, everything should be in focus. Make the red ball the focus point, and then everything is the exact same brightness levels, but everything is in focus. Don't turn off enable depth of field. Don't be smart asses. So.